everybody hear me? I hope so. Um, Hello, and I hope you had a good session in the last session and a good break after that. I wonder how many people were attended the Breakaway 2 discussion, because I think it leads straight into what we're going to end today with. It's a great pleasure to introduce the first of the keynotes that does not rely on words and speech. As mentioned in our introduction and the booklet, we experience food viscerally and in an embodied way. So it seems crucial to have keynotes at a conference like this where we experience the movements and feelings of the body much more directly than we can with words. I'm delighted to introduce Jacki Job as this evening's keynote presenter. Jacki was born in Cape Town and is presently a senior lecturer at the School of Dance and Department of Drama at the University of Cape Town. The dancing career began with Jazz Art, a dance studio established during apartheid and resisting racism in the arts training world. She extended her professional experience by traveling widely in Europe and eventually Japan, where she lived and worked for many years. It was in Japan that she was introduced to the dance style Buto, which she continues to draw on and I think inflect in her own very distinctive way. When Jacki returned to South Africa, she acted as artistic director of Jazz Art. She also began to pursue a more academic path alongside her dance from 2011. Jacki has held numerous awards, residencies, and fellowships. These are numerous. They include the David and Elaine Potter Fellowship, co-producing the first Japanese-South African contemporary dance collaboration, who has won, being a resident artist at Session House in Tokyo, a resident at a dance festival in Vienna, and many others. She has conceived numerous works, so I urge you to Google her to find out about more. Just to mention some though, as a choreographer for the Cape Town Opera, she was instrumental in the 2014 production of The Marriage of Figaro, and a few years later produced Dancing in the Dark. One of her recent works, which is called And Then, was transformed into a cinematic dance last year. This is what we'll be seeing and what she will raise ideas about. Let me just conclude before handing over to Jacki to say that I've seen this before and I'm so tempted to say something about my sense of the work in relation to the themes that have been raised at this conference, especially the last session, but I will hold back. Jacki, over to you.
Thank you, Desiree. Thank you. Thank you very much for that warm introduction. Can everyone hear me? I guess that's the standard question to ask on these platforms. I'll wait for thumbs and stuff to go up. Everyone can hear me? Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, Desiree, thanks for extending the invitation. I really appreciate it. It's certainly a privilege to be speaking here this evening. Good evening, everybody. As Desiree mentioned, I am a dancer choreographer and also a senior lecturer in the Center for Theatre, Dance and Performance Studies at the University of Cape Town. My research practice revolves around asking what it means to be a person beyond a human-centric approach and how this can be of value in our philosophical and embodied grapplings with processes of transformation in South Africa. As a tool of inquiry, my current performance series, as Desiree mentioned, is called And Then ... This work is conceptually inspired by the insect, the praying mantis, and our discussion this evening concerns the subject of And Then ... Why the praying mantis, you might wonder? Well, the insect is significant in cultures across the globe. For the Khoisan, the mantis is a harbinger of good luck. For the Native Americans, it symbolizes peace, and the Egyptians saw it as enabling communication between the living and the dead. Its status is especially significant in Egypt, where during one excavation in Brouwer, a small coffin that contained a mantid wrapped in linen was discovered. Then there are Chinese martial arts forms based on the mantis behavior, and on several commercial platforms, mantids are used as emblems across several genres of contemporary media. So tracing narratives of the praying mantis could therefore be described as following strands of our universal relationality sustained over hundreds of years. On a personal level, though, the praying mantis is significant for me as I correlate the physical idiosyncratic movements of the mantis, that incessant shake, with the zeitgeist of South Africa. For me, the physical shaking of the praying mantis seems to mirror a general state of nervousness, imbalance, and unease felt by many South Africans on many levels. In terms of its movement quality, which of course interests me as a dancer, its proportions seem flimsy and the movement pattern is almost arrhythmic. It can remain nervously perched, shaking on its spindly legs for long periods of time, observing, contemplating, it seems, and then suddenly move or fly off in an unexpected direction. And when it does decide to move, it always seems to take the longest, most indirect path, right? So, interestingly, in spite of its iconic universal status, praying mantids project qualities of uncertainty, indecisiveness, powerlessness, even. And for me, transposing those qualities into a South African context becomes provocative, as those descriptions do not align with the psychological and emotional descriptions of success. Generally, qualities of uncertainty, weakness, and vulnerability are frowned upon. Rather, displays of power implied in bold actions, clear decisions, and stable economic and social structures are desired. In South Africa, these stable descriptions of identity measure the distance and successful ways in which Black people have moved beyond the debilitations of racial configurations. But, and then, considers the praying mantis as a teacher and puts forward that digging into qualities of weakness, imbalance, indecision, and vulnerability that arise from this current dire socioeconomic and insecure psychological states we are experiencing could potentially be impactful and powerful in thinking through the meaning of personhood and transformation in South Africa. So, how do these themes then connect to the themes of the conference? Well, as a student of the praying mantis, I cannot answer directly. And so by way of explanation, I need to give just a brief context. And then, is an ongoing, ever-evolving work, as is implied in the ellipsis in the title. The first iteration was performed in 2018, and at the time, the driving force behind that iteration was the concept of desire. Now, when one thinks of desire in relation to the praying mantis, and then to the theme of consumption, which inevitably is encountered in critical food studies, I'm hoping that the discussion's relevance will become more evident to you this evening. It is a well-known fact that in the act of mating, the female mantis bites the male's head off. Desire could thus be seen as satiated with an act of violence. However, a lesser-known fact is that the dead body of the male mantis is not to satisfy the female mantis directly. Once she's eaten, she rests. And instead of digesting the male's body for herself, the body provides sufficient fuel to sustain the next generation of mantids developing inside of her. The mantids are thus concerned with progeny, with futurity. For the female, there is a vision of how what comes from her body moves beyond her in terms of time and space. And this long-term vision of progeny can also be perceived in the male's action, which is almost like a sacrifice, a giving of himself for the sake of what is still to come. Seen in this way, the praying mantis thus becomes a paradigm, which I think of in Giorgio Agamben's terms as an analogical logic, as if a new ensemble is made intelligible. It makes what is imagined and not yet in existence visible. Or to borrow from Harry Garuba, it presupposes the future. The act of consumption, therefore, in terms of the praying mantis, is not a simple, selfish act of desire. Something more implicit is in this act. For me, an underlying sense of compassion in the praying mantis is revealed. Compassion makes space for the other, And it is in this compassionate space between oneself and another, a different element, person, or thing, I believe, that transformation occurs. Whereas desire is consumed with self, compassion is to be moved by the other. It's to allow the other to move, to do according to their will without inserting one's personal desire. And of course, both qualities are relevant. One could think of desire, and I do, as a thought that inhabits physical and mental places that are hidden. And as a consequence, they are enacted in the dark or in secret. And so examining secret desires, therefore, reveals aspects of our plural identities. Compassion, on the other hand, I describe as a quality that relinquishes the desire to control and determine outcomes based on standards set by social norms and different kinds of expectations. Instead, compassion demonstrates a sensitivity, and realizing compassion necessitates a relinquishing of the self. But how does one do this in everyday life? Here, I believe that cultivating a sense of communion is important. And in terms of communion, I'm thinking of with all elements, within and around ourselves, as well as in material, inanimate, and spiritual realms. Cultivating communion is important. I know that the term communion could be evocative of religious practices, and so somehow there may be a sense of ritual that could be imagined with that word. But that is not where I intend to go with this discussion. I am thinking about communion as an act that cultivates connections with what is different to myself. And in that connection, opens up the self to change, to influence, to be influenced. Another brief digression to explain. In Japan, the Buddhist philosophy called En exists. Now, reductively, this word En could be understood as or described as a coincidence or chance. Bryn Jensen, Mio Ishii, and Philip Swifts wrote an article in 2016 called Attuning to the Webs of En that gives a more complex nuances of this philosophy. And they denote En as, I quote, the combination of external and internal causes, as well as the relations beyond human knowledge, which form interrelated webs around the universe. End of quote. Attuning to the webs of En is to arrive at a heightened awareness, a receptive attitude toward the surprises of non-human beings and even things that might be hidden in our plain view. So in my practice, I cultivate this philosophy of En, to be in communion with the intra and interrelationalities of activities within and around myself. Thus, the centralizing of self and that of being human as the primary agent of action and knowing diminishes, and something else can effectively then be the agent of action. Granted, some imagination is necessary to realize these connections, but transformation cannot be reliant on the intellect alone. And with that, I mean on knowledge that is already formed. In order to transform, we have to move towards innovating and not replicating patterns of doing and thinking. Thus, what we know has to be cast aside, and who and what we think we might follow also, I think, should be cast aside. So towards this end, I imagine multiple lines crisscrossing inside my body, as well as in the external physical space. Tim Ingold, when discussing the Evenki people of East Siberia, he describes their ways of perceiving their surroundings as the entire meshwork of intertwined trails along which people carry on their lives. Traveling along these trails, therefore, is enriched with a sense of, in Ingold's words, always being somewhere, and every somewhere is on the way to somewhere else. In my dance, I imagine this crisscross of lines inside my body and in the external space as elastic lines. And this perception effectively breaks down notions of structures. In other words, by virtue of being elastic, nothing is fixed and everything can change form. Like when one pushes against something elastic, it moves away from the body. So thus, imagining all edges as elastic creates a distance between oneself and the structure. And it is in this space, as I mentioned before, I believe that the potential for change lies. This notion can be applied to reimagining a different response to socio-political constructions. And on a corporeal level, imagining the body's edges as elastic expands it from having fixed limitations, thereby building a consciousness or a heightened awareness that effectively transforms the way we conceive ourselves and others in the world. In other words, we build a consciousness that liberates us from external descriptions of the body and its functions. This consciousness feeds a psychophysical sensibility that can receive different impulses and images of oneself, others, and other things. It's like there's a chemistry that is created between multiple entities. And Deleuze and Guattari, they describe this as a coming into a molecular proximity with the subject. So, with this kind of consciousness, therefore, I can create a synergy between difference and what is different, and in that process, become the other and find a sense of connection or closeness on a molecular level. Moreover, in imagining these elastic lines into space that surrounds the body, it radically shifts the quality of moving through the environment. Immediately, this imagination forces a mode of moving that renegotiates the surrounding world. As opposed to just blazing through the space with a sense of self confidence, it forces a reconsideration of the texture and meaning of the world through which one moves. Elastic lines are thus constantly imagined, encountered, and engaged with in movement. In terms of dance, these invisible yet conceptually visible lines afford opportunities for traveling alongside or in collaboration with the space. There is a consciousness of encountering things all the time, and one begins to feel the interpenetration of elements both visible and invisible. The French philosopher Henri Bergson states that man has maintained a memory of the interpenetration of all forms only very slightly. He claims that man has sought to realize himself and succeeded, but only by abandoning a part of himself along the way. I put forward that a particular philosophical embodiment influences psychophysical movement patterns that allow synesthetic responses, the noticing of details, a heightened sense of consciousness, and then we can begin to glimpse the possibilities of the imagination to extend beyond the limited conceptions we have of ourselves. So, by following the path of the praying mantis as a teacher, the centrality of the body is relinquished, the self assigned human centric hierarchy is resisted, and instead, one begins to perceive the importance of communion and its correlation to compassion, thereby making one available to the deep reception of others and other things. And this journey, I believe, is ongoing, it's endless. And then, dot, 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 who knows what might happen next? Thank you. That's the end of my talk. We'll now move on to watching not yet, but we'll just move on to watching the 2020 iteration of And Then. And following this film, I look forward to discussing whatever you may encounter within and or around yourselves as you receive this work. So please enjoy. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. We had problems with the screening of the video and time was running out. And I think, yeah, this dance raises such a lot. I'm just waiting for Jackie to join because we now have about 10 minutes left. Um, hmm. Yeah, we thought we would have a substantial amount of time to at least begin to raise some discussion. But what I am thinking is how we ended off with the session in Breakaway 2. Hi,
Sorry.
Jackie.
Sorry.
No, it's fine. I also struggled. And I don't know, after a performance like that, it's really just so difficult to get into speech mode. Suddenly you kind of confront the absurdity of speaking, of language, when there's just so much energy and intensity beyond language, beyond the spoken word. So, do you want to just say something quickly in terms of how the video panned out? Because it didn't go quite as smoothly as we'd hoped.
Well, on my side, it was stopping like for 1 or 2 seconds every now and again. So I felt like, all things considered, and knowing that these things and networks are out of our control, it wasn't too bad. It wasn't too bad on my side. But I imagine that different people experienced it differently depending on their networks.
Yeah.
I hope they got a sense of the progression, the smooth progression.
Yeah. I think for most people who had reasonable networks, there was a sort of progression. And I'm just wondering if, did you get my message? I'm just going to raise this here. It's probably not the appropriate place. But I'm wondering if you can join us on a panel tomorrow to take this discussion forward. Oh.
Me? Oh, um, maybe we can talk about that after.
Okay, no, let's
Yes,
talk about
yes,
that afterwards. But we do
yes.
have a few minutes. Is there anything where, well, there were lots of comments in the chat. Um, Incredible. We'll never watch, Vanessa Ludwig says, we'll never watch The Mantis again without thinking of this performance. Amazing performance. Thanks for this. And I think what people are also speaking to is the sense of impasse that we ended off with the last session, which is not because the discussion was not productive, but because there's a sense in which we are groping, especially when we are talking and thinking about food and the visceral and the sensual, um, that there's a realm of feeling, and there's a realm of what the body experiences that one just doesn't access through language. But Habiba's got a question here. Can you speak about the continuity you craft between humans and the non-human in your dance, given the way Africans have been portrayed as animalistic? Interesting
Yeah,
question.
yeah, that's a good question. Thank you.
Mhm.
Um, Well, I think for me, what's really important about bringing the animal into that, to make the animal human configuration, is really important, to reconfigure and reimagine identity. And not to show that, look, I am human. I am actually, I'm subverting I think that our our focus on wanting to be human, on our focus on our centralizing that idea, is just centralizing the whole uh, um, racialized perception that the racialized perception that the West has made. So instead of trying to say, I'm not like that, look, I'm just like you, I'm actually really leaning into the argument and saying, maybe there is something else to learn about if I move away from just this configuration of human. And also because that whole human animalistic thing has got a completely the whole Christian background when it comes to made in God's image. Made in God's image is literally, is like, so, which we know, because of the whole idea of being made in God's image, means that if you are not human, it gives me the right to treat you like I want, right? And so it has validated a lot of racialized action, and so, or racist action. And so for me, it's not about proving you wrong, but it's, and by leaning into the binary, but by accepting and believing that with bringing all of these things on and finding the interpenetration between all these different elements, something else can be discovered. And so there's this wonderful argument that Derrida speaks about the what might have happened before shame happened. If we go to the story, the Bible story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and then discovering their nakedness, that moment when they discover their shame, and that moment that then creates this divide between the human and the animal. What happens if we just had to go to the moment just before? Might there have been a different story? And I'm thinking that if one goes into that kind of different imagination of what might have been, and really kind of feel that, really go into, before words, just an experience of like these energies that we all share, there's another narrative that we can create, and we can actually change the way we can change the way we see the past, so that we can keep the part, that it becomes a different way to inform to what is happening to us now in the present, and then informs our future a whole lot differently. And I think the reason why I'm also feeling this way, I mean, everything has got the same, we all have the same mineral kind of qualities, right? It's just different quantities that make the rock, a table, me, Jackie, the wall. But everything is energy that can change. And so if I really trust that, the fact that nothing is stable, everything can change, and everything is actually connected in terms of physics, everything is connected, then we can find something else. We can create another kind of imagination of ourselves, and really begin to change a story on a real organic level. We, on a cellular level, we begin to change that story. I don't know. I was a bit rambling a little bit, but it's very exciting to begin to connect to our animal selves, our plant selves, our granular selves, and just release ourselves from this hierarchy of being so important and knowing so much more as the human, because clearly we don't. And I think we need to just release ourselves of that kind of that belief, and then see what else is going to happen. Doesn't mean there's another belief necessarily, but there's a curiosity and there's an openness to discover something else. And then that experience then becomes embedded in the body, which then over time creates a belief. But again, that's just an energy. And so there's this idea that it's always changing and always transforming. And so we never get stuck into one kind of mode of who we are and how we are. And I find that very exciting. It gives me lots of hope. And it kind of makes the all these negative kinds of ways of being looked at disappear. They don't matter. They really don't matter.
And I think it's interesting when you speak about communion, there are such cliched, sort of stereotypical ideas about communion and union, which are so human centered. And I think what this dance does is it forces us to shift all that and just kind of abandon it, because even the idea of the piano, which is an instrument which is
Right.
mastered by the player, the piano also becomes this active presence, and there's a kind of sense in which it has a life of its own. So just you're encouraging us to reimagine what life is, where life emanates from, and totally decentering the idea of a human-centered world, it's also shocking. It's
And it's
hard to
frightening,
grasp.
I think, yeah.
It's frightening, yeah.
Because that
It's
means I won't be important, but actually we
of
become
course.
bigger. Collaboration always
Well,
makes us bigger
exactly.
and better, actually. You know,
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so, just if I could say, like, for example, with Jose, you're talking about the piano and how it's the player that masters the instrument. And so Jose also has the same similar kind of concept of understanding that it's
Yeah.
not just, like we have to be in communion with other things. So for him, when he approaches the piano, he remembers that the piano was once a tree. How would one approach the instrument if you remember its past? And you
Yeah.
remember how, so it came from something else, and those energies remain. They may be
Yeah.
deeply, deeply hidden, but they remain. And so can we begin to connect with those hidden energies? And then we're really working with desire. But it's not just about me. I'm wanting to allow the other. So I have this kind of relinquishing of myself and compassion and communion. And it becomes really, it's a lot of chemistry and a lot of vibration that happens then. And I
Mm.
think that if we could all, I mean, it could sound airy fairy and stuff, but one starts to imagine if more of us were working like this and with unknown and not wanting to be so sure of ourselves all the time, and actually being okay with doubt and with struggle and with imbalance, because I think it takes a lot of strength to be able to be vulnerable, to be able to be weak requires a lot of strength.
Mm.
And in that weakness we'll find out what else holds us up.
Mm.
What other things can hold me, what other things can push me forward.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
Um,
we are looking at a moment, and we are currently at a moment when we have to think differently. Otherwise, we're just going to die. You know,
absolutely.
the idea of humans knowing it all and kind of dominating it all, it's just not possible. Are
Yeah.
there any other comments or questions? Because we have run out of time, and maybe I can call you separately about the possibility of your appearing on a panel so that we talk to you a bit more, but that's not a certainty, of course. I think
Here's an
everyone,
interesting question. The
where?
the Ben Jamison, Ben Jamison Stanley, they note that could you, am I seeing the right thing now? Yeah. Could you comment on how your performance might complicate ideas about eating? Oh no, somebody spoke about the lion. What am I reading? Among the Basotho, each clan has a totem symbolized by a dignified animal. Mine is the lion. Others include the elephant, the rhino, the leopard, etc. So these animals are our family. Um, for me, what's interesting is why I'm choosing the praying mantis, which I think is going to go into the next question. Comment on your performance might complicate ideas of eating. It's more familiar to think of eating as something we humans do that constructs our human cultures, and non-human animals are simply eaten, whereas I was struck in moments of your performance by the thought that I'm looking at a mantis eating. I have very little content for thinking about that. So how you're thinking about eating in this work, or what might it mean to think about eating in a way that decenters the human? Well, I think if the well to kind of link the two, so the totem animals. It's interesting for me when people often when totem animals are spoken about, they're big and bold. The lion, the rhino, they're strong. They symbolize very kind of clearly. They symbolize status and strength. Whereas the praying mantis is the which is why I mentioned how it's an iconic figure and been an iconic figure for millennia. And in fact, it's part of the cockroach family, so it's a survivor. It's as old as older than the dinosaurs. And it's an insect that's insignificant, and yet it's still here, and yet it's influenced so many people and so many different cultures. And that's what I find really interesting. It's about this invisible. So when I speak about eating and drawing from the praying mantis eating and thinking about progeny, it's about how we can do that through intimate acts which might be invisible, which might not be easily noticed. I think that is perhaps a difficult place to go, because we're always wanting to show. And so already the insect in itself is not showy. It throws everything off. All the stuff that we wish to and that we want to hold on to for ourselves. It throws all of those things are completely out of whack, because it's making the invisible, if one, I think, goes into detail, the invisible visible. And this thing of progeny, and that is the future. um, and it's incomplete also. It's always on edge. You're never quite sure, all doubt, etc. And that's to answer your question. I think that's what I'm thinking of in terms of eating. It's this thing of communion and connecting with and ingesting, and at the same time there's a sense of the other, and so I'm making space for this other inside of myself and outside of myself by how I move through the space. By moving through the space carefully. It's that kind of eating, that kind of consuming I'm talking about, is a
Yeah.
sense of building connections with
What I
what's in.
was also thinking about in relation to eating is that for me, what strikes me is not only literally eating, what we understand as eating, the act, but the ideas about eating, the very human ideas, the anthropocentric ideas about eating, which is so often associated with guilt, whether it's kind of religious guilt, um, not eating too much, moral guilt, guilt about eating meat, guilt about eating certain things, or exploitation. The fact that what one eats is so. Whereas it's almost as if you're leaving that behind, or encouraging us to leave that behind, um, so that one is really kind of not feeling like a human, being encouraged to not be human. Yeah. Anyway, that's something that occurred to me also with
Yeah. And
eating.
I mean, these things can't be so finite, right? Which is, it's not like, I know I'm a human, right? I can't go to the
Yeah, of course,
to the
it's not that you
SPCA if
ever
there's something wrong with my leg, right?
yeah,
So
yeah, yeah.
I'm aware of that, but there is so it's just a consciousness. It's just like a consciousness and opening up a vibration to make space for what we think might be different,
Mhm.
and then we realize that they're that we're not that different.
Mm,
Um, and that's the only way that we can find our connection is through difference.
yes.
And so yeah, I guess that's what it's all about. Vanessa's asking about, but I don't think you have to say if we can carry on speaking or if we take this.
I think let's just, if we can, just take Vanessa's. Where's Vanessa? I've been really bad with finding people today. What did
Vanessa
Vanessa?
Ludwig has said that you speak about the spiritual significance of the mantis in various. Could she please expand? Well, I mean, just briefly. So, I mean, the Kwe-san, they see the praying mantis as a, I mean, I don't want to use the word sacred, but it's an important symbol, a symbol for bringing good luck. There was, it has ideas of it's bringing rain. It's knows something of before. So there's this phrase that decolonial aestheticians use, which is before us, which is similar to the Sankofa bird idea, is looking back in order to look forward. So this, and the mantis seems to hold on to this. So whatever was before you, right? So whether that's my ancestors, whether it's or the elements that came before me, I hold before me. So what came before in this moment I have in my presence in order for it to guide me for what must come before, and so what must come next. So it's
Mm,
this it's and I think that is kind of the way that the Khoisan, if I just stick with the South African kind of idea, and then the Egyptians also, this idea of the praying mantis being a godlike medium between the living and the dead.
mm,
So again, and it's as if again it connects to that before us, because what's before came before you. If it's ancestors, they might have died, but I can hold them in my living presence in order to guide me towards the future, which I may or may not be a part of.
mm,
But there's that kind of wonderful richness, I think, that comes in. I think when one starts looking at different details of the insect,
mm,
and why it might have been held as to be so profound to different cultures all around the globe.
mm, mm. Um, oh God, there's another question. Why is the courtship so dangerous? Oh, okay. Why take the male if female mantis can asexually reproduce? Well, I don't know. I mean, maybe Jackie, you can answer that. But in some ways, it's taking us to another level. Do you want to respond to that?
Well, also, I mean, my first thing is like, what is wrong with danger? That would be my first thing. Why would danger be something to be avoided? Because when something is dangerous, we become more alert. Our
Mm,
awareness, if we know that we're entering something that is dangerous, our senses
mm,
sharpen.
mm,
We know
mm,
that we cannot relax. We know we cannot just rely on the eyes in front of that's in front of us. We have to rely on eyes on our back. We have to
mm,
rely on the eyes under our feet. Our ears
mm,
have to begin to listen differently. We have to begin, we smell differently. The touch, everything is heightened. And that's what danger produces.
mm.
So I think I would love to have my senses completely awakened in a courtship, I have to say. It's not something I'd want to avoid.
I think that's a wonderful response to that question, especially at the very end. And I think this is a wonderful way to end the day because I mean, it's opening up of questions and exploding so many things. It's taking us. It's a very productive way of working through things, rather than having a nice, neat interpretation of the dance. And this is what eating means, because I don't think that's what it's been about at all. Jackie, thank you so much.
Thank you.
We're going to close now. We will probably raise this again tomorrow. We will start promptly at 9 tomorrow. No. Sorry, we will start at 8:30 because we have a play by UWC students. So many people will probably have to miss that. But please do log on at 8:30, and then the sessions will start from 9. Thank you so much for today, everybody, and have a wonderfully restful rest of the day. I won't say evening because we're not all sharing the same time zone. And Jackie, thanks once again.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thanks for your attention, everyone.